Oh, so you're all set?
Yep, I'm all set.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming. And today I want to talk about the canal. And when I thought this was what I wanted to do, I set up the date. And believe it or not, it's the 4th of November.
Is it really?
And the 4th of November is when the canal was officially opened, with dumping water from the Great Lakes into the Atlantic, and then bringing water back from the Atlantic and dumping it in Lake Erie. That started on November 4th. So it's 200 years ago today, what I'm going to be talking about. I guess that's deja vu, huh? It was on this day in 1825, New York's Governor DeWitt Clinton, and that's the sketch of DeWitt Clinton over there that Bill just brought in, stood on the deck of a packet boat anchored off Sandy Hook and poured a barrel of water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic Ocean. This, quote, wetting of the waters, as it came to be known, was the symbolic completion of the Erie Canal, the most important waterway of its day and the engineering project that once and for all sealed New York's fate as the most important commercial city in America. The canal opened on October 26, 1825, and a cannon was fired in Buffalo to mark the moment. A series of cannons along the canal and the Hudson River had been set up for the occasion, and each gunner heard the shot, he fired his own. In 90 minutes, the news passed cannon to cannon along the waterway to New York City. So you can hear these cannons. When you hear it, then you put yours off, and then when yours goes off, next guy hears it, and he sends his off, all the way from up here in Buffalo down to New York City. 10 days later, the first boat arrived in New York, and Governor Clinton poured the water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic. Over the next century, New York's port would expand exponentially, quickly becoming the busiest in America. By the time of the Civil War, New York's control over shipping was so complete that nearly all the cotton being shipped from the South to Europe was being sent out of New York Harbor, rather than directly from the southern ports. So even cotton was coming up through the canal. The wetting of the waters, like I said, was 200 years ago today. The ceremony was the culmination of a 10-day journey for a flotilla of boats led by the Seneca chief, and that had departed from Buffalo on October 26, 1825. The start of the journey was announced to Albany by cannon chain, where a cannon was fired at intervals, allowing news to travel the length of the canal in just under 2 hours. So in under 2 hours, the notice was sent from Buffalo to New York City, 363 miles. The canal was the largest public works project in North America at the time, and it overcame a significant elevation difference of over 570 feet between Lake Erie and the Hudson River, primarily through the use of 83 locks that would raise the boats up and bring the boats down. The canal's completion immediately reduced the cost of shipping a ton of wheat from Ohio to New York City by about 90%, from $100 to ship it to less than $10. That was modernization. The canal contributed to the growth of many cities along its route and helped transform these cities, like Buffalo and Chicago, into major metropolitan areas. The Erie Canal became a vital gateway to the West, facilitating westward expansion and immigration to the American interior. So there was a quicker way, an easier way, than a horse and buggy, or on a horse per se, to get to the West. You had a throughway that went from New York City through to Buffalo, and then you could go on from there. It's a story we didn't learn in fourth grade, said this one lady, manager of the Erie Canal Harbor Development Corp. We hear very little about indigenous peoples, and that's another angle, is what it did to the Indians along the way, this improvement of the Erie Canal. In 1825, Buffalo's Seneca chief opened the canal. It famously carried Governor DeWitt Clinton and other dignitaries to the city of New York in the fall of 1825 to celebrate the canal completion. Although it was quite early in history of steamboats, more than 20 steam-powered boats also took part in the celebration on November 4th, 1825. A few days later, the New York Spectator described the celebration. The Grand Fleet arrived in our waters from Albany at a few minutes after 5 o'clock in the morning and came to near the state prison. The roar of cannon from different points and the merry peals of our numerous bells greeted the sun as he rose in a cloudless sky. In a few moments afterwards, signals were given by the flagship, and the various flags, banners, and other decorations were ran up as if at the sudden command of a magician. This fleet consisted of Chancellor Livingston, Captain Lockwood, under the special direction of Charles Ryan, Esquire, acting as Admiral, assisted by Commodore Wiswell, having in tow the elegant canal packet boat, the Seneca Chief of Buffalo. The Constitution, Captain Bartholomew, having in tow the Rochester boat, Young Lion of the West. On board of this boat, among other productions of the West, were 2 living wolves, a fawn, a fox, 4 raccoons, and 2 living eagles. Noah's Ark, having the bears and Indians, fell behind and did not arrive in Albany in season to be taken in tow. But you can see this was a big deal. They were sending lots of things down this canal to show that this canal could handle it. Next came Chief Justice Marshal, Captain Sherman, having in tow the Niagara from Black Rock. Then followed the Constellation with Captain Crittenden, the Swiftsure, Captain Stocking, the Olive Branch, Captain Moore, having in tow the safety barge Matilda, and the Richmond with Captain Cochrane. A lot of ships going down the canal to prove what it could hold. The Saratoga, Captain Benson, being a small and swift boat, acted as a tender on the voyage from Albany, landing and taking in passengers from all boats and landing places. She sported about like a dolphin, now in the wake of one boat, now alongside of another, and now shooting ahead of the whole with her flag streaming gracefully in the breeze. That was the show-off, I guess, showing everybody how fast she could go. This was the order in which they left Albany, and although during the darkness of the night they did not exactly preserve it, yet at a given signal, they were soon in their proper places. At this moment, the new and superb steamboat Washington, Captain E.S. Bunker, came proudly toward us. Not the least pleasing of this morning's scene was the packet ship Hamlet, Captain Candler, prepared by the Marine and Nautical Societies, appearing at sunrise in the North River, superbly dressed in the flags of various nations, interspersed with private signals and a number of flags of different members. DeWitt Clinton on the Seneca Chief, she made the most splendid appearance during the whole day. At 8 o'clock, these societies met on board the steamboat Fulton, Captain R. Bunker lying at Fulton Street Wharf, and were conveyed on board of the ship, where Captain J.G. Collins, assisted by his officers, took the command. At 8:30 the corporation and their invited guests assembled in the sessions room at the City Hall, and at 9:15 proceeded to the steamboats Washington, Fulton, and Providence, stationed at the foot of Whitehall Street. At the same place was also stationed the Commerce, Captain Seymour, with the elegant safety barge Lady Clinton. This barge with the Lady Van Rensselaer had been set apart by the corporation for the reception of ladies with their attendants. A few minutes after 9 o'clock, the whole being on board, the fleet from Albany, as before mentioned, led by the flagship of the Admiral, came round from the north and proceeded up the East River to the Navy Yard. They were followed by James Kent, the Swifter, having in tow the barge Lady Von Rensselaer, Olive Branch towing the barge Matilda, the Eagle, Fanny, Governor Walker, John Marshall, Oliver, Providence, Tomlinson, and Commerce, Captain Seymour having in tow the Lady Clinton. There were a lot of ships, showing off the usefulness of the Erie Canal. In passing the Navy Yard, salutes were fired, and the sloop of war, Sian, was dressed in the colors of all the nations. It was crowded with spectators. On the returning from the Navy Yard, the steamboat Ossintani of Derby joined the fleet. The boats on the approaching Governor's Island were saluted from Castle Williams, off which the fleet was joined by the ship Hamlet. The ship Hamlet was taken in tow by Oliver Ellsworth, Captain Havens, and Bolivar, Captain DeForest, and assumed and maintained his place in splendid style. 4 pilot boats were also towed by other steamboats. In the opening of the Erie Canal parade that began at the Battery after the fleet had landed their passengers at 4 o'clock, the following workers marched in groups, along with firemen, military leaders, various societies, tailors, bakers, coopers, butchers, tanners, curriers, skinners, comb makers, shoemakers, hatters, stone masons, house painters, stone cutters, chair makers, saddlers, shipwrights and caulkers, boat builders, pilots, tin plate workers, printers, bookbinders, booksellers and stationers, cabinet makers, and coopersmiths. Everybody got in on it. Everybody was celebrating the opening of this Erie Canal. After the ceremony, the Seneca Chief was placed in commercial service for freight and passengers by owner Thaddeus Joy as a line boat for the pilot line. You can see how it was such a big show. Everybody wanted to get involved with this opening of the Erie Canal. It meant prosperity. It meant moving your goods from the inside of the state to the coast, where it could be shipped out even to other nations. You had an ability to ship produce like you never had before. This was boats on the Erie Canal. Bullhead freighters carried flour and grain. Line boats carried both people and freight. Scows carried lumber. Icebreakers were used to lengthen the boat's season. In other words, they could go into the bad weather. But the queen of the canal were the packet boats that only carried passengers, as many as 100 at a time. You can imagine at that point having 100 people on a ship going down the Erie Canal. Those boats were 80 feet long and 14 feet wide. After dinner, narrow beds were folded down for the night. The New York legislators had become interested in the possibility of building this canal across New York in the first decade of the 19th century. Shipping goods west from Albany was a costly and tedious affair. There was no railroad yet, and to cover the distance from Buffalo to New York City by stagecoach took 2 weeks. Governor Clinton enthusiastically took up the proposal to build a canal from Buffalo on the eastern point of Lake Erie to Albany on the upper Hudson, passing through the gap in the mountains in the Mohawk Valley region. By 1817, he convinced the legislature to authorize the expenditure of $7 million for the construction of a canal that he proposed would be 363 miles long, 40 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, which is what the canal was when it was originally dug. The work began on Clinton's Ditch in August of 1823. Teams of oxen plowed the ground, but the most part of the work was done by diggers who had to rely on primitive tools. Remember, there was no dynamite. There were no machines to lift dirt out of the way. The machines you had was human power. They were going to dig this channel from Buffalo, essentially, to Albany. And it was only literally manpower that did the digging. They were paid $10 a month, and barrels of whiskey were placed along the canal road as encouragement. West of Troy, New York, 83 canal locks were built to accommodate the 500-foot rise in elevation. After more than 2 years of digging, the 425-mile Erie Canal was opened on October 26, 1825, by Governor Clinton. The effect of the canal was immediate and dramatic. Settlers poured into western New York, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Goods were transported at 1/10 of the previous fee in less than half of the previous time. The modern throughway, right through, as opposed to a horse and wagon. Large loads of farm produce and raw materials traveled east as manufactured goods and supplies flowed west. In 9 years, tolls had paid back the cost of construction. Later, enlarged and deepened, the canal survived competition from the railroads in the later part of the 19th century. Today, the Erie Canal is used mostly by pleasure boaters, but is still capable of accommodating large barges. This date of opening of the canal is considered one of the largest momentous instruments in New York history, in U.S. history. October 26, 1825, the Wedding of the Waters ceremony begins in Buffalo, with Governor DeWitt Clinton opening the complete Erie Canal. October 27th, the Wedding of the Waters flotilla reaches Rochester. October 29th, at Weedsport, David Remington and Henry Whitman are killed when their cannon for the celebration accidentally discharged. October 29th, the Wedding of the Waters flotilla reaches Syracuse. November 2nd, it reached Albany. November 4th, the flotilla arrives in New York City in great fashion and conducts the next part of the Wedding of the Waters, and a massive parade follows. November 23rd, the Seneca chief of the opening flotilla returns to Buffalo to complete the Wedding of the Waters. So they got Atlantic water, brought it back on the boat, and dumped it in the lake. That was the end of the Wedding of the Waters on both ends. Canal boats were pulled by horses or mules and traveled about 4 miles an hour. The boats floated in the water in the canal, and the horses and mules walked beside the canal on a dirt towpath. Ropes were tied to the boat and to the horses or mules, but not all was work. Folk took pleasure rides on 80 by 14-foot queens of the old Erie Canal called packet boats, which accommodated up to 100 people and provided meals and lodging. So you had pleasure boats, too, on this new waterway. In October of 1825, Clinton was aboard the Seneca Chief as it entered the Erie Canal at Buffalo, leading a flotilla in celebration of the canal's completion. 90 minutes later, the citizens of New York City learned of the event from a relay of cannon fire along the banks of the canal. As the boats proceeded eastward along the canal, speeches were delivered at towns and cities all the way. In Albany, at tables set up on a long bridge across the canal basin, 600 diners toasted the accomplishment. So you had all kinds of parties and get-togethers on that day. On November 4th, the fleet of canal boats towed down the Hudson by steamboats reached New York City. The boats assembled off Sandy Hook, where Clinton poured a keg of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic. A magnificent ball was held on November 7th to complete the festivities. The center of attention in the ballroom was a scale model of a packet passenger boat made of maple sugar floating in a large vat of Lake Erie water. Presiding over the gala, Clinton proudly celebrated the culmination of a project for which he had fought long and arduously. We had a tugboat captain here, the last tugboat captain on the Erie Canal, David Starkweather. He ran a tugboat on the canal here, and he's listed as the last tugboat captain on the Erie Canal. Was an Albion person. Okay, a few details. The length in miles of the original canal, 363. Number of locks in the Erie Canal in 1825, 83 locks. Number of locks in the Erie Canal today, 57. Depth in feet of the original canal was 4. It's now 12 to 23 feet deep. Elevation change in fleet from Buffalo to Albany, 571. Aqueducts to bypass rivers and streams, there were 18. 200 cities, towns, and villages are along the canal. 5 days it took to travel the canal from Albany to Buffalo. 14 days it took to travel from Albany to Buffalo via stagecoach. So you can see this was fast. 10 years it took for the canal to return its $7.1 million investment. So it took a while, but in the transportation and the economic development, it paid. It cost passengers only a penny and a half to travel the length of the canal. The cost of moving a ton of freight from Albany to Buffalo cost $20 and took 8 days. It cost $100 and took 20 days to do that by wagon. So you can see the comparison. Traffic on the new canal exploded. The canal brought in $500,000 in tolls its very first year. Before long, the canal was bringing in profits of $3 million annually. The cities of Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse flourished because of this. And New York City quickly grew into the commercial capital it is today, eclipsing what had been larger port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. New York's population would quadruple between 1820 and 1850. By 1853, the Erie Canal carried 62% of all U.S. trade. Farmers in Ohio demanded canal links from their own communities to the Great Lakes so they too could ship cheaply to New York City. So everybody decided they wanted a canal too, because it worked so well in New York State. Canal projects spread across the country. Never mind the fact that canal traffic would soon be eclipsed by long-distance railroad shipping. About this time, Jesse Hawley, a relatively obscure merchant in Batavia, New York, became a leading promoter of this idea. While confined to a debtor's prison in 1805, he wrote a series of essays for the Genesee Messenger in which he laid out a detailed plan for the construction of a canal across the state, proposing that it be funded by the federal government, which funds from the sale of western lands. Hawley's plan would ultimately become the basis for the Erie Canal, except that it would be funded by the state of New York, not the federal government. The state legislature formed a commission which included Robert Livingston, Robert Fulton, to develop the project. After some frustrating attempts to attain federal funding, culminating in a veto of the project by President James Madison, The new state commission began to focus on the idea that the state of New York on its own would undertake the project. Another problem was the source of the capital to build such a grandiose project. That was unclear. However, with the end of War of 1812 and the success of such technological projects as Robert Fulton's steamboat, this was a time of some optimism. DeWitt Clinton, nephew of Governor George Clinton and former mayor of the city of New York, who had run successfully as a Federalist candidate against Democrat-Republican James Madison for president in 1812, became the head of the Canal Commission. At the time, Clinton was at low ebb in his career, though he did have an idea, which, though not original with him, would prove to be the idea whose time had come. At first, the construction of the canal went well. The first 70 miles between Rome and Syracuse went over relatively flat terrain, where the work was completed on time and relatively close to budget. By 1821, at a ceremony for the opening of the middle section, DeWitt Clinton exuberantly proclaimed that the entire canal would be completed by 1823. However, when the canal builders reached the Niagara Escarpment, they ran into trouble, as their cities had predicted, and the work fell behind schedule. Charges and countercharges were made about mismanagement of the canal project, and DeWitt Clinton was defeated in his run for governor in the election of 1822. On November 4th, 1825, there was a formal ceremony at the Battery, and Clinton poured Lake Erie water into New York Harbor. At the ceremony, New York Mayor Cadwallader Golden, whose grandfather had first raised the possibility of building a canal more than 100 years earlier, stated not since the pharaohs had irrigated the upper Nile Valley 2,000 years earlier had such an important water project been built at any one time in this place in the history of the world. The cost of shipping a ton of wheat from the Ohio Valley to New York City dropped approximately $100 a ton to $6 a ton. The Port of New York, which carried 1/3 of the nation's commerce to Europe in 1820, would carry 2/3 of it by 1860. Tolls on the canal, which had been projected to pay off construction costs in 20 years, did so in 7 years. By the 1840s, canal tolls were paying more than $2 million into the coffers of the state of New York, creating a canal fund that would back up New York banks. Most importantly, farmers, manufacturers, and merchants along the 500 miles from the Great Lakes to the city of New York now had direct access to the national market. Land values throughout the state skyrocketed, and the canal was soon widened to accommodate increased traffic. So it was being more and more prominent in everybody's life because you could grow crops. You could ship them on the canal for a lot less than you could have a horse and buggy transport them. And you were making money. That's called prosperity. And the Erie Canal was behind it all. The canal lowered costs for shipping freight, decreased travel times across New York, and gave rise to industries and cities along its path. It transformed New York City into the nation's principal seaport and created a new gateway to the Midwest and the Great Lakes. So the Erie Canal is equal to saying prosperity. You had a new, faster way to transport your goods. And in that, you could make more money because it didn't cost as much to transport them. Issued by the Corporation of the City of New York, this invitation asked Mr. A. Leonard to a ceremony that celebrated the opening of the Erie Canal. On November 4th, 1825, at 8:00 a.m., attendees met at City Hall, then journeyed to Steamboat by Sandy Hook, where a ceremony pouring Lake Erie water into the Atlantic took place. In the preceding 10 days, a flotilla had moved from Buffalo to Albany along the canal, then moved down the Hudson to New York City. A parade and a banquet concluded the celebrations. So this was the big deal of the day. Over 100,000 people along the shores of the Hudson and East Rivers and in Manhattan watched the harbor celebration and the parade. Remember, this was 2/3 of the entire population of Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, Staten Island, and Manhattan at the time. Never before in North America had such a large crowd of people turned out for a celebration. This was an invitation to a celebration on the completion of the canal November 4th, 1825. So 200 years ago, this invitation was sent out. Issued by the Corporation of the City of New York, this invitation asked the recipient, Mr. A. Leonard, to a ceremony that celebrated the opening of the Erie Canal. On November 4th, 1825, at 8 o'clock a.m., attendees met at City Hall, then journeyed by steamboat to Sandy Hook, where a ceremonial pouring of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic took place. In the preceding 10 days, a flotilla had moved from Buffalo to Albany along the canal, then moved down the Hudson to New York City. A parade and a banquet concluded the celebrations. Then I want to get to Orleans County. November 4th, 1825, in Orleans County, New York, residents would have been celebrating the recent completion and full opening of the Erie Canal. So 200 years ago, we as a county were saying, yes, that canal's finished. Yes, I'm going to get more money for my produce. Yes, look at all the prosperity. While the canal officially opened with a flotilla departing Buffalo on October 26th, the culmination of the celebration, known as the Wedding of the Waters, occurred in New York City on November 4th. News of the grand finale would have been quickly transmitted along the new waterway via cannon fire and could have been received in Orleans County on the same day. The celebration, the Erie Canal, was completed in 1825, connecting the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. The opening was marked by a week-long flotilla journey led by New York Governor DeWitt Clinton aboard the packet Seneca Chief. The key events related to the canal's opening in late October and early November 1825 included: October 26th, Governor Clinton and other dignitaries began their inaugural voyage from Buffalo. A continuous volley of cannon fire set off to relay from Buffalo to New York City announced the canal's opening to communities along the 363-mile route. November 4th, the flotilla arrived in New York City's harbor, Governor Clinton performing the Wedding of the Waters. November 23rd, to complete the ceremony, the Seneca Chief returned to Buffalo with a barrel of Atlantic Ocean water to pour into Lake Erie. And that completed the connecting of the ocean and the Great Lakes. The canal's significance to Orleans County. Orleans County, established the same year as the canal was completed, was greatly impacted by the new waterway, which runs for 25 miles through the county. Villages like Medina, Albion, and Holly developed into thriving port towns, benefiting significantly from the new trade and commerce that passed through. For Orleans County residents, November 4th, 1825, the news of the canal's full completion would have been particularly meaningful. The new transportation route meant that goods could now be shipped from much faster and cheaper, ushering in a new era of economic prosperity for the region. The canal transformed the economies of towns and cities, allowing new populations to move in and industry to develop. 1822, the western section was underway, but when the surveyors reached Oak Orchard Creek, it was necessary to bypass the deep ravine, which is now known as Medina Falls. They swung southward, making a U-shaped section which created a natural docking area. It took 2,000 to 3,000 men and 700 horses to build the canal. Laborers earned 50 cents a day. Engineers earned $1,500 to $2,000 per year. I looked in our newspapers. We weren't founded till that same time period. So we didn't have a real newspaper that could, and if we did, I don't have copies, let's put it that way, of the newspapers in 1825, because we were just getting formed ourselves. But this is the Medina Journal 100 years after that, in 1925. The first canal boat in Medina 100 years ago today. The formal opening of the Erie Canal as far as Medina was completed occurred 100 years ago today by the arrival of the first canal boat here, which docked at the old wooden wharf in the canal, almost the rear of the present Daily Journal office. This occurred on October 26, 1825, and at that time the business section was mostly along the waterfront. Some jumped from travel in those days by canal packet to the automobiles and airplanes of today. In the Orleans Republican, March 31st, 1875, it's said that a variety show and menagerie to occupy 3 boats will travel on the Erie Canal this summer. So the canal was still the route to use. Orleans Republican, July 12, 1899. Only about 800 boats now navigate the Erie Canal. 15 years ago, there were 5,000. Times had changed by 1899. And I'd like to end this with the pioneer history of Orleans County, which was written in the 1870s. I looked in it to see what it said about the Erie Canal in Orleans County. It says the work in digging the Erie Canal was begun in the middle section near Utica on the 4th of July, 1817. In 1823, the eastern part of the canal was so far completed that in November, boats from Rochester reached Albany at the same time with the boats from Lake Champlain on the Champlain Canal. And in November 1825, a fleet of boats from Buffalo passed the entire length of the Erie Canal, carrying passengers to the Grand Canal celebration in New York. To no part of New York State has the Erie Canal proved more beneficial than in Orleans County. Although the soil was fertile and productive and yielded abundant crops to reward the toil of the farmer, yet its inland location and great difficulty of transporting produce to market rendered it of little value at home. Settlers who had located here in many instances had become discouraged. Others who desired to immigrate to the Genesee country were kept back by the gloomy accounts they got of life in the wilderness, with little prospect of easy communication with the old eastern states to cheer the hope. As soon as the canal became navigable, Albion, Holly, Knowlesville, and Medina, villages on its banks, were built up. Actual settlers took up all the unoccupied lands and cleared them up. Speculators came here and bought up large tracts and left them wild to rise on the market. The lumber of the country found a ready market and floated away. Wheat was worth 4 times as much as the price for which it had been previously selling. Prosperity came in on every hand, and mud dried up, and the mosquitoes and the ague and the fever and the bears left the country. Farmers paid for their lands, surrendered their articles, and took deeds from the company. Good barns and framed houses and houses of brick and stone began to be built as the common dwellings of the inhabitants. The good time coming, which was the first settlers could not see, but waited for with a faint dismay, but persistent hope, had come indeed. The price of lands rose rapidly, making many wealthy who happened to locate farms in desirable places from the rise in value of their lands. From this time forward, rich men from the eastern states and older settlements began to come in and buy out the farms, with improvements of those who had begun in the woods and now found themselves, like Cooper's Leatherstocking, lost in the clearings, and wished to move on to the borders of civilization, where the hunting and fishing was better, and where the ruder institutions, manners, and customs of frontier life to which they had become attached would be better enjoyed among congenial spirits. In other words, they were hitting for good times, not those old pioneer days where everybody really was kind of, not up to date. The clearing away of shade trees, thus drying up the mud, and the substantial bridges over streams and leveled and graveled highways, which the numbers and abundant means of the people now enabled them to establish, occasioned a demand for other carriages for the convenience of those now independent farmers and their families. A little progress and pride ambition substituted horses and lumber wagons as the common vehicles of travel, in place of the oxen and sleds. A buggy was no more known or used than a balloon in those wagon days, and when the canal was first made navigable, there was none probability of one-horse buggy in Orleans County. And that's how it affected us here in Orleans County. Anybody have any questions? Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. And now you know. You can just be very proud when you cross that bridge when it's open. My husband and I, we were asked by our daughter if the bridge was open yet. She lives in Pittsburgh. And we said, yeah, the last time we were down, it was still open. Because she would come up from Pittsburgh and come up from Medina and around because the canal bridge was closed. But now it's open and we're good to go again. Anybody have any questions? Thanks for coming, everybody. I appreciate it. And Bill, thank you for bringing DeWitt Clinton.
The picture I brought in normally hangs in the Gaines Basin School.